and welcome to Sipz and Stories. My name is Elizabeth, and in today's video I will be taking you on a tour of London's bookstores and some of the surrounding cities such as Bath and Oxford. I have not been back to the UK for several years since lockdown, and it feels so great to be back. I love it here. Not only do I love the people, the culture, maybe not the food, but I especially love the bookstores here. And London has some of the best bookstores, in my opinion, in the entire world. It's like the mothership of literature. So grab your favorite beverage of choice as I discuss some of my favorite London bookstores. The first bookstore that I visited on this trip was Daunt Books, and I've been hearing about Daunt Books for years. I've missed it on my last few trips to London, so I didn't want to miss it this time. It is actually located in a kind of new to me neighborhood, Marylebone in London. Not sure if I'm saying that correctly, but I loved this area. I thought it was really beautiful, really classy. It's not as crowded as Piccadilly or Covent Garden area, but it is really nice. So a good place to stop for lunch or a coffee as well when you're visiting Daunt Books. This store is absolutely stunning. What can I say that everyone else hasn't said already? One thing that I didn't realize though until I visited the store itself was that it's actually a travel bookstore, and they organize their books in a very unique way. So they organize the books not really by author, but by country and region of the world where the story takes place or where the author is from. I thought this was a really interesting way to organize the books, since this is how I like to read anyways. Whenever I'm visiting a new country, I always like to read both fiction and nonfiction from that country. And so if you like to do that too, I think you will absolutely love Daunt Books. I wasn't super impressed though by the US section. In fact, I found that a little elitist. I saw nothing by David Macaulay in that section, which shame on you, Daunt Books. You really need to get more David Macaulay. That being said, it was really fun to see in the Japan section books about Tokyo right alongside Murakami, which I thought was really interesting. Same thing can be said for the Italy section, Portugal, and really throughout the world. They have a lot of really unique books at Daunt Books, and just kind of sitting along the shelves, I found a lot of these slightly foxed editions. I have been wanting a slightly foxed edition for years now, and so I was excited to pick up my first slightly foxed edition at Daunt Books. They are really small, low profile, naked hardback books. Here they are alongside more of a trade paperback book, so they're quite small. They're also very pricey. This book was probably the most expensive book that I bought in this entire trip. It was 20 pounds, which currently is not too bad if you're from the US, but typically that's about $30. So really expensive for this little book. That being said, I really love it, and I'm glad to have it in my collection now. This one is The Blue Remembered Hills by Rosemary Sutcliff, and this book has been on my TBR for quite some time. Rosemary Sutcliff is a very famous children's British author. She's written dozens and dozens of books for children. This is actually her memoir of her childhood growing up in the 1920s in a very rural area of the UK. She also suffered from, I think, a disease, Still's disease, when she was a teenager, and that just affected her childhood. Her mother was also a manic depressive as well, so it's supposed to be a very interesting memoir, and I'm really looking forward to reading it. The next bookstore I visited is probably one of the most iconic bookstores in London. It's been around for over 100 years, and that is Foyles, of course. Foyles, I believe, was independently owned and operated for decades. I think they've recently went corporate, but it's still a stunning and a really iconic bookstore to visit in London. It's also huge. It's over 5 stories, and the children's department alone is worth visiting. So if you love children's books like I do, I think Foyles has one of my favorite children's departments of any bookstore in the entire world. I cannot think of any book in the English language, quite frankly, that is probably not in Foyles. It just has everything you could possibly want, from classics to fiction to nonfiction to recent books that just came out. So I love Foyles, and it is a must on any bookstore trip to London. It is also very modern in design. It reminds me, if you remember Borders in the US, I really miss Borders. I used to work there when I was a teenager, but it has like those clean lines and clean design, a lot like Borders used to be. It also has a cafe upstairs on the 5th floor, so if you are looking to kind of take a break from Charing Cross and the busy district of Covent Garden, it's a nice place to kind of hang out and browse for an hour or two and have a cup of coffee. So what did I pick up at Foyles? I picked up Agnes Grey by Bronte. I have been meaning to read this book for years now, especially since I discovered Tenant of Wallfell Hall, which I absolutely loved during last Victober. Bronte, I have to say, is fast becoming my favorite Bronte sister. I love her. She's just a little more down to earth, more cynical, more real, but also very more hopeful than her sisters, I would say. So definitely Charlotte and Emily are the geniuses in the family, but Anne Bronte is the one that you can most relate to, which is why I think I like her books the most. She is also very fierce and independent, and she tells things like it is. I love Tenant of Wallfell Hall, but I think I actually liked Agnes Grey more, if that can be said. I just love this story. I thought it was really sweet, really romantic, about young Agnes Grey who becomes a governess and kind of gets disillusioned by all these wealthy families that she works for. I loved it, and it was a great start to Victober. This edition is published by Faber, which is why I picked it up. I just thought it was absolutely stunning. If you're at Foyles, you are right around the corner from one of the newest bookstores in London and one of the most exciting, and that is the Mina Lima shop. So Mina Lima, of course, is very famous for doing all of the graphic design work for the Harry Potter movies. They've also recently come out with a lot of special editions of children's books, both the Harry Potter books and children's books like Peter Pan and The Secret Garden, which are published by HarperCollins. And I've shown you my Mina Lima collection. I made a separate video for that, so if you'd like to see that video, I will link it below. But I absolutely love these editions with the interactive elements and the cardboard cutouts and the beautiful illustrations by Miafora Mina and Eduardo Lima. These books are beautiful in person and a must-have for any children's collection. So I actually own all the Mina Lima editions, and the new one, Snow White and the Grimm's Fairy Tales, is coming out later this year, I believe in November. I thought that Mina Lima might have some editions that you could get at their shop, but you can't get them until November, so I did not get any books at Mina Lima. But they do have a number of cards and prints and notebooks, which is really exciting for me, again, if you are a Harry Potter fan. I got this potions making notebook, which does look like that edition of the Half-Blood Prince's textbook from Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince. Love this, and it was really nice to have a notebook on this trip to jot down all of my ideas, all the bookstores that I want to visit, and all the coffee shops that I want to see in and around London. I also picked up this really adorable bookmark of Peter Pan, which is actually one of my favorite Mina Lima editions. So if you're only going to pick up one Mina Lima edition for kids, I do recommend that edition of Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie. And Mina Lima was a just really stunning little bookstore. It was very dinky. It did look like it belonged in Diagon Alley. The floor was the Marauders map, and they couldn't have been any more lovely. They let me film in there. They had no problem with that. So if you are a Potterhead, I do think it is a must stop on your visit, and the staff is so friendly and so courteous. The next bookstore that I visited on this trip is actually a chain here in the UK, like Foyles, like Blackwell's, but the flagship store is in Piccadilly, and that is Waterstones. So as an American, I love Waterstones. It's a lot like Barnes & Noble, but just better in every way, and I really love the way that they merchandise the books in Waterstones. It's another one like Foyles that has just hundreds and thousands of books. I can't think of any book that you cannot get at Waterstones, and this store in Piccadilly is actually my favorite Waterstones location. It's over 5 stories, and it just has so many great books. I especially love their classic sections. They had a beautiful display of Everyman's Library, of Penguin Cloth-bound classics, and they also had a really nice display of independent publishers like Persephone and like the British Library editions. And so I love this bookstore. It's a really nice place to take a break from all of the touristy things that are in the area. So if you are just getting tired of all the museums and all the tourists, I do think Waterstones is just a nice place to browse and sit down at the cafe, have a cup of coffee, and just relax if you're in the area. And if you're anything like me, you will not leave the store without buying a few books. So what did I pick up at Waterstones? The book that I picked up was Dangerous Ages by Rose Macaulay, and this is one of those British Library Women's Writers editions, which if you are from the US, you cannot find at all, but they are all over the UK. And I love these editions. I think they are so charming with the profiles of the women. Love these. Dangerous Ages has been on my TBR for a long time, and so I read it during this trip and I loved it. I gave it 5 stars. This is fast becoming one of my favorite books, and Rose Macaulay is becoming one of my favorite new authors. She is very similar to Virginia Woolf, except she is not as long-winded as Virginia Woolf, so her books feature some of those similar themes. There are a lot of modern themes in this book, like abortion, free love, LGBTQ themes in this book, which is really unique and special for a book that was written in the 1920s. One of the characters, Neville, actually goes back to school in her 40s to be a doctor, so I loved this book. It is about 4 generations of women in this family, everyone from the matriarch, the mother, Mrs. Hillary, who is in her 60s, even the grandmother, who is in her 80s, is in this book. And then Mrs. Hillary's 2 daughters, Neville and Nan, who are both in their 40s and 30s. And then the granddaughter, Greta. It does get a little controversial when Greta actually steals Nan's boyfriend. It's such a great book, and if you are a woman, you must read this book. Dangerous Ages by Rose Macaulay. So after you stop by Waterstones, you're probably gonna keep heading down the street, and this next bookstore is probably my favorite bookstore in all of London and probably the entire world. And on my last couple trips to London, I completely missed it because it's right next door to Fordham and Mason. So don't be like me and go straight to Fordham and Mason and miss this bookstore, because it is so iconic. It's so wonderful, and if you are a book lover like me, it is a can't miss stop on your trip to London, and that is Hatchards, of course. So I do not know how I missed this before, but I can easily say now that Hatchards is my favorite bookstore in the entire world. I loved it. I thought it was so beautiful, it was so classy, and for being so classy, the staff could not have been any friendlier. So they were perfectly fine with me filming in there. They were nice about giving me recommendations. The store was cozy, it was very charming, but yet it was very easy to browse in there with all the tourists. I love this bookstore. I also like the aesthetics of this bookstore. I think it is one of the prettiest bookstores in the entire world. It has floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Most of the bookshelves on 3 floors are these black hardwood bookshelves. It gets even cuter in the children's department, where they are all this periwinkle blue color. I loved it. I also fell in love with this bookstore when I got off the stairs and I immediately saw a whole wall of P.G. Wodehouse. That's when I fell in love with Hatchards, because P.G. Wodehouse was right next to Agatha Christie, and that just made me so happy. Hatchards also has these special editions that they publish in-house by Penguin Random House, and I did not know that about Hatchards, which came as a pleasant surprise when I visited the bookstore. So I picked up this edition of Don't Tell Alfred by Nancy Mitford, one of my favorite comedic writers of all time, and it was really fun to get this in this special Hatchards edition. It just has beautiful end papers, and then it is one of 2,000 copies, so it is marked. And Hatchards has these all over the store. You just have to look for them. They're kind of very basic hardbacks like this. And the purpose of them is to help you build a classic library, which again is why I just love Hatchards. I also picked up this book, The Clockwork Sparrow, by Katherine Woodfine, and this one has been on my TBR forever. This is another one I never ever see in the States, but I wanted to read this for so long. It is a children's mystery that takes place at Sinclair's department store. I first heard Robin Stevens talking about this book, who is the author of Murder Most Unladylike series, and she couldn't have been any more right about this book. I'm reading it now, and it is so cute, so adorable. It's about this little department store that is a lot like maybe Selfridges or Harrods, and there is this jewel robbery that happens at the department store. It is so charming and delightful, and I'm so happy that I found this book at Hatchards. I barely scratched the surface of all the bookstores in London. In fact, I'll probably have to go back and do a part 2 of this video when I return in a couple weeks. But there are a few more bookish places that you're gonna wanna visit in central London, especially if you love children's books like I do. The first, of course, is Paddington Station. Now, Paddington Station has always been this kind of place of romance to me because of the character Paddington the bear, but it actually came in very useful on this trip. I was there a lot during this trip, just taking the train to Oxford, to Bath, and so now I feel I have a very good knowledge of Paddington Station. So what did I want to buy there? Of course, I wanted to buy this edition of Paddington the Bear by Michael Bond, or A Bear Called Paddington, I should say. And I own multiple copies of the Paddington books throughout my collection, but I've never taken the time to actually read the book, and it is absolutely adorable. I loved it. And if you are a newcomer to London in the UK like me, you will really relate to Paddington the Bear, as he makes all of these awkward mistakes like I did getting on the tube in the wrong direction. So I am so happy that I got this edition of Paddington at Paddington Station. Geeky, I know, but I love it. Another iconic bookish place that you will want to visit in central London is the British Library. It's one of my favorite places in London, and actually when I get to London, it's one of the first places that I like to visit. It's very inconspicuous, so you might miss it. It is in this very low profile brick building that's right across the street from King's Cross train station. But the books themselves are housed underground, so I believe it is like 4 or 5 stories underground. So very, very interesting. It's not as ginormous as like the Library of Congress, but it is just as big in terms of all the books that are housed at the British Library. I love it. My favorite thing about the British Library is the treasures room. So it is a must visit if you love books and literature like I do. They have a whole section devoted to writers such as Jane Austen. In fact, they have Jane Austen's writing desk. So I think it's worth visiting if you are a Jane Austen fan like I am, just to see that writing desk where she wrote so much of her iconic books. It also had some letters from Oscar Wilde and some letters from P.G. Wodehouse. It has some original lyrics from the Beatles, Gutenberg Bibles, and then when I was there, they did have a special exhibit dedicated to Leonardo da Vinci, so they had some of his original pages from his notebooks, which just kind of blew my mind. It also has a really, really charming store and bookstore at the British Library, and some really fun special editions, including this edition of Matilda, a 30th anniversary edition, featuring Matilda at 30 years old, where she is the CEO of the British Library. I saw this online a couple years ago, and I was so excited when I found it there at the British Library. It actually has a special stamp on it that says the British Library. And I believe there are 3 books in the special 30th anniversary editions. One of them features her as the CEO of the British Library. One of them features Matilda as an astrophysicist, and then another one features her as a world traveler. So I think these are so unique and special editions of Matilda by Roald Dahl, and I really like that Quentin Blake came back 30 years later to illustrate these covers. They are so fun. Another bookish place to visit in London is on the South Bank. So if you are visiting any of the theaters over there, like the Vic, the Old Vic, and the Globe, you're probably walking along the South Bank anyways, and during the week, and especially on the weekends, they have this big kind of like flea market of books, and it's just really fun to browse around there. I loved it. It's right alongside the Thames. It's just kind of another bookish experience that you can have in London. It's absolutely wonderful. So as I said, I was at Paddington a couple times to take the train first to Bath for the Jane Austen Festival, and then a few days later to Oxford to visit the Bodleian Library. So in Bath, it was a lot of fun to see the city for the first time. I have never been to Bath before, and I really wanted to go for this Jane Austen Festival, which was a lot of fun. There were people in Regency costume running around the city, and so it did feel like you were on the set of a Jane Austen movie or on the set of Bridgerton. I did visit the One Royal Crescent Museum, which is a lot of fun if you just want to see what life was like in the Regency era. The first book that I picked up, I actually picked up at the Jane Austen Museum, which was really quirky and weird and adorable at the same time. They had a lot of Jane Austen London merchandise if you're into that type of thing like I am. And this book is great. It came in really useful on my day in Bath, and that is Jane Austen in Bath, Walking Tours of the Writer's City. I love this book because it not only told you the history of Jane Austen and all of her books that are set in Bath, the history of the Regency era, but it also came in quite useful in terms of trying to figure out how to get around Bath, and then just some of the new modern tea rooms and museums that you can visit in Bath. So I do highly recommend this guidebook to Bath. Unfortunately, the Jane Austen Festival was on a Sunday, so I really wanted to visit Persephone's new location in Bath, but it was closed because it was Sunday. So I did take a peek through the window. They have moved locations from London to Bath now, and I did have the privilege of visiting their London location, so I don't feel like I missed out too much, but the Bath location looks just as charming and adorable, judging by those windows. But I was really excited to find a new bookstore in Bath that I'd never heard of, and that was Mr. B's Emporium. Look it up. It is one of the cutest little bookstores I have ever visited in the UK. It's very cozy. It has a lot of nooks and crannies, multiple floors. It's a very pokey little bookstore. And they had right in the window this edition of The Confederacy of Dunces by John Kennedy Toole. I wanted to read this book forever, and I especially love this edition of Confederacy of Dunces by Penguin Clothbound Classics. I think it is one of my favorite Penguin Clothbound Classics editions just because of those hot dogs on the cover. You could not beat that. So I am really looking forward to reading Confederacy of Dunces soon in this very special edition. The second day trip I took was to Oxford, of course. I've been to Oxford a couple times, but I have never been on the Bodleian Library tour until this time, and it was like a very religious experience for me. If you are a book lover, you absolutely must take the Bodleian tour. It's so much fun. They don't let you film in there, of course, because the books are so old and so rare, and they don't like them exposed to cameras. But oh my gosh, guys, it was like more religious than the Vatican for me in there. I loved it. And so you cannot really do any research in the Bodleian unless you go to Oxford. But as a tourist, it is fun to see that very iconic library. Oxford is home to one of my all-time favorite bookstores in the UK, and that is Blackwell's. And Blackwell's is all over the UK. They actually have a really great online presence as well. They are my go-to for shipping books to the US if I'm looking for any of those special UK editions. But their flagship location in Oxford is really unique and really special because it's literally across the street from the Bodleian. So I like to picture like really smart astrophysicists and scientists going to school at Oxford and then walking across the street to go pick up their books at Blackwell's. It's a great bookstore. It is full of books. I can't think again of anything that you couldn't find at Blackwell's. On this visit, I've never been to the ground floor with all the textbooks, and so it's fun to kind of just walk around and see some of the textbooks that Oxford students would buy. There were a lot of Norton English anthologies in there. If you're an English major, you know your Norton anthologies. But that being said, they also had a section dedicated to writers that went to school at Oxford and are famous for being in Oxford. Of course, a big selection of Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, a big selection of Alice in Wonderland books by Lewis Carroll, and then a lot of books by the modern day C.S. Lewis, Philip Pullman as well, who is kind of a staple in Oxford. So what did I pick up at Blackwell's? I got this edition of The Reading Life, which is an essay by C.S. Lewis. I've read parts of this before, and it's basically just C.S. Lewis telling you not to be a snob about reading, that reading should be accessible for everyone, all classes, and all age ranges, especially children. Love this and happy to have this in my collection now. And then Blackwell's also did have a lot of books by Philip Pullman, of course, who is the author of His Dark Materials. I love that series. It's one of my favorite children's series. And again, I do tend to think of Philip Pullman as like a modern day Tolkien or C.S. Lewis. And it had this signed edition of The Collectors, which is one of the latest short stories set in His Dark Materials in that world. So it's a part of a 4-book series of The Serpentine, Once Upon the North, and Lyra's Oxford. So I was gonna get Lyra's Oxford, and then I saw that this new edition, The Collectors, was signed by Philip Pullman, so I picked up this one instead. I really enjoy having this book, and you'll notice that a lot of these iconic bookstores that I'm mentioning in this video, they just have a lot of signed editions for some reason, since so many authors are from the UK and pay respect to some of these iconic bookstores. It's very easy to find signed editions in Waterstones, in Blackwell's, and in Toppings, of course, which I'll talk about soon in my Edinburgh video. So there you have it, everyone. Thank you for joining me for my tour of London's bookstores. I had a great time visiting these bookstores, revisiting some ones that are favorites, and discovering new favorites like Hatchards. And I can't wait to come back to London and visit more bookstores because I barely scratched the surface of this city and this very bookish place. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.